Hi, everyone. My name is Tahra Hoops, and I am joined with my co-host, Gary Winslett. And today we have a very special guest. We have Nolan Gray, who is the Senior Director of Legislation and Research for California YIMBY, and also a professional city planner. He is currently completing a PhD in city planning at UCLA. I believe you live in California still, a widely published author with works appearing in The Atlantic, Bloomberg City Lab, The Guardian, and also if you were active on Twitter, you might have seen some of his many great posts. Nolan, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Tara. It's nice to see you, Gary. Thanks for having me, guys.
For sure.
Glad to have you. Good to see you as well, Nolan.
So we'll get started with some of the great reforms that we've seen come out of California lately in terms of housing. There has been so many great ones. You recently called the 2025 CEQA, which is the California Environmental Quality Act reform, possibly the most significant housing policy reform in like modern history. We also had SB 79 passed. We had a fast track package go through. By any honest measure, obviously you had a really huge legislative year. Set the table for us out of 2025. What was like the big win? What does winning actually feel like from inside California YIMBY right now?
Yeah, well, I can say the mood in California YIMBY right now is great. Let's keep going. The process is working, and let's double down and fix a whole bunch of other things that are stopping up housing production in California. But yeah, we definitely paused and we're pleased about 2025. I think a few things came to a head. I mean, the post-pandemic, the housing affordability just, burst onto the scene as one of the top issues. I think that we're finally to a place in California where there's broad consensus that housing affordability is the number one problem, and the roots of that problem, while multifaceted and complex, ultimately come down to a severe housing shortage. So we got that consensus. And then I think we just had real leadership around it. People like Assemblymember Buffy Wicks and Senator Scott Wiener have been working tirelessly on this issue for, in both of their cases, close to a decade now. And the governor saw that, hey, this is a top priority. I think it probably helps that he has presidential ambitions and wants to be able to say that he helped to solve one of California's biggest problems. And so the political stars really aligned, and good ideas, research had been done, policy had been developed. It's the classic, like, what is the goal of a think tank? Like have the idea ready to take off the shelf when the stars align. And so we achieved that. I'd say the two biggest things that came out of 2025 were, as you mentioned, one, we got a full exemption from CEQA for all infill development. So I'll spare people the really painful details. But essentially for the past 70 or so years, California has said that if you want to build almost anything other than a single family home or other sort of narrow exempted projects, you have to undertake a large environmental report. This is hundreds, sometimes thousands of pages long, documenting all of these totally hypothetical impacts. In the case of infill projects, of course, this was, we know that infill development is good for the environment. So this was kind of a bizarre exercise. But then the worst part was that this opened you up to litigation. So this is sort of another sort of infamous feature of California housing permitting over the last 70 years, and why we built so little housing was that you would nearly always get sued if you tried to build housing. And so this would delay entitlement and permit process for months, if not years. And for the longest time, I mean, when I first started doing this work, the idea of a clean CEQA exemption was just unfathomable, right? Like, it's like, well, we're gonna create a bunch of exceptions and we'll get you out of CEQA, but if you meet this labor requirement or this affordability requirement, or if you pay these fees, this is pretty clean. I mean, for all development under 85 feet, with limited exceptions, these projects are now exempt from CEQA. So that was really, really huge. And there were other things in the Senate budget bill that also streamlined CEQA in cases where it still does apply. So that was really, really awesome. And I think we're already seeing the benefits of that because that took effect when essentially the budget was passed. The second thing we did was the kind of modus operandi of California YIMBY. We were founded when Senator Scott Wiener first introduced SB 827 back in, I guess, 2018. And the idea here was, look, the state's spending billions of dollars on transit. Let's make it legal to build mid-rise multifamily housing within a half mile of transit. It's a good, clean bill. Had it passed, California might not have a housing crisis today. But it famously actually died in its first policy committee hearing, which is, if you don't speak legislative speak, that's a kind of a disaster for a bill. But it started this big national conversation around why don't we allow apartments near transit? That's weird, right? Came back next year with SB 50, almost passed it, had a bunch of compromises in it, and it died like a handful of votes short. But so then California YIMBY, we buckled down and spent the last few years, making progress on various other aspects of it. But with SB 79, we finally got a statewide upzoning within a half mile of nearly all major transit, rail, bus, rapid transit across the state. And so it's really exciting. That's going to take effect on July 1st, and it's kind of phased in. So probably about 60% or so of the law will kick in on July 1st of this year. And then it'll be full phase in beginning with the next arena cycle, how we do housing policy in California. It's an amazing place to be in because YIMBYs on X and Blue Sky, God bless them, are mad at me that the bill is not even more radical and moving any quicker. And I love that I report to people like that. But already cities are having to undertake some of the largest upzonings in California history. Mm-hmm. So I'm excited that we solved these two problems. And now I think we really need to do the work of like, okay, we've got a lot of zone capacity. We've solved a lot of the streamlining, or we've solved a lot of the permitting and entitlement hurdles. Now we just got to make these projects feasible.
So I wanted to follow up on that in a couple of different ways. The first one is just on like the litigation friendliness you pointed out as being a problem. Because like that's also a problem where I live in Vermont, that Act 250 just makes it super easy to sue any project near you you don't want to see. I know that that's also kind of a problem with condos in California. Because like most of people, a single family home is like really expensive. Your easier path to ownership is condos, but like I know California has these regulations that make it really easy to sue condos in construction. If I think I'm getting that right, can you just like talk us through that problem there? Because I think you wrote about that recently.
Absolutely. So as I mentioned in my last response here, we're really focused on feasibility now, and something kind of interesting about California housing production is we build almost no condos. And, condos kind of briefly became a dirty word, I guess, in, 90s, 2000s. But, a condo is just an apartment that you can own, right? And in a state like California where land prices are so high, a 2 or 3 bedroom condo, that is the starter home of 2026, right? That's how you're going to create mass homeownership among working and middle class families in California. And yet we build almost none of them. And, a lot of folks have done a lot of excellent research on why that is. But one of the recurring themes is that in our effort to make sure that consumers are protected when they buy a condo or when they buy into a condo complex or building that has some sort of defect, we want to protect them and we want to make sure that they're made whole if it's something that the developer could have and should have foreseen. But what we've done, I think, as we've done in many policy areas in California, is we went to the opposite. We went so far in that extreme that basically every new condo development resulted in litigation, in many cases frivolous litigation. And so, of course, if you're a small local developer, the risk of any litigation is just you're immediately going to avoid that project. But even for small builders, they basically said, look, unless it's a luxury project that's going to, or it's an extremely small project that's going to avoid litigation, I am not building any condos. And so one of the bills that we're working on, again, with someone like Buffy Wicks this year is AB 1903, which is trying to just better balance that. Basically say like, yeah, hey, look, sometimes there are defects. Like the developer should be required to go and fix those defects. But we shouldn't immediately and always launch into litigation. We shouldn't give people incentives to sort of vastly overstate the nature of the problem. Like, let's go in and make condo buyers whole, but then also not have a framework that scares off any condo production. So we're working on that. Another bill that we're working on is 1406, which is trying to deal with this pre-sale problem. So in many other parts of the developed world, for example, Canada, they build, it's the complete opposite, right? Like they build almost all condos and they build only a handful of rentals. And part of it's because they don't have this condo defect litigation problem that we have. Part of it's because of their tax structure, but part of it is also because they allow for pre-sale revenue or the revenue earned from selling a condo necessarily before it's been built to be used toward the financing as long as certain construction milestones are being met, right? And this is not like hypothetical, right? Like my mother-in-law in Guatemala City just purchased a new condo using this. She puts 25% down. Everybody else in the building puts 25% down with a reputable developer who's built a bunch of projects. The money's slowly released. In California, as in many U.S. states, we don't allow that. So we're very restrictive on pre-sales. So there's not this easy financing mechanism that condos enjoy in the rest of the developed world. And so those are our two big priorities this year. And hopefully we'll fix that and start getting some condos built.
That's really interesting because, I live in northern Vermont. I go to Canada all the time. And, every time I go, I notice that there's all these, condos for sale. And I'm like, what's going on there? So that's cool. I didn't know that. It's also interesting that you point out how, this, consumer protection that's well-intentioned when it goes too far ends up having this, snapback sort of causal thing where it shuts off new housing supply. We actually have a thing like that in Vermont where our tenant protection laws are so stringent that they strongly incentivize people who own rental properties to rent them out as Airbnbs rather than long-term rentals, because if you have a bad Airbnb guest, that's a one weekend problem. Whereas like if you have bad tenants and it happens to be anywhere near winter, you like can't get rid of them. And so it just incentivizes all the people who own properties to like, you know, not rent it out long term. So it's interesting how some of these like well-intentioned things can end up backfiring if you take them too far. I did want to ask you about success, like in terms of actual like housing production. Like the policy wins are awesome, right? But like the ultimate thing we do want is like more housing production. Nobody thinks that like you're going to get a new house the day after a bill is signed. Like that's not reasonable. Derek Thompson recently flagged that California still hadn't seen too many housing starts after 79, even though, as you say, it's still not really fully implemented yet. You would push back by pointing out that like Auckland and Sao Paulo and New York City took like 1 or 2 years from the upzoning to see housing production increase. So like, can you walk us through just like what your view of the timeline is? Like what's a realistic timeline for us to assess, hey, this has really worked in these ways. Hey, this didn't work as well as we thought it would. We need to rethink that. Like, can you just like walk us through how you think about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, at California YIMBY, we're totally focused on outcomes, right? Like, I'm always I run our legislative program with an amazing team, and I think there's 2 failure modes for our organization. One is the obvious one, which is that we just can't pass bills. If we can't pass a bill, then like, why do we exist, right? But the other failure mode is we get really, really good at passing bad bills, right? And like that, I think a lot of advocacy organizations in, DC, you guys don't really pass bills or do bills. You do like one budget bill and like a bunch of weird stuff happens. But like out in the States, right? Like it's not that hard to pass a bill, but it's very easy to pass a bill that's got a number of poison pills and flaws. And so like, I think it's great that we're having this conversation. We don't care about bills passed. We don't care about lines of state law changed. We care about housing units produced. And so as far as like assessing the impact of SB 79, I would say, yeah, law takes effect on July 1st. It's going to take time for applications to get through the process and for construction projects to start. I would say, yeah, if we're 2 years from now or 3 years from now, and we've not seen a significant increase in permitting in parts of the state that are affected, yeah, I would say that's a sign that something's gone wrong and we need to go back and revisit it. I mean, it's always tough. Another thing I might just fall into is I might say, well, look, Trump is like, interest rates are high. Trump is tariffing construction materials. There's a lot of chaos happening in construction labor with strict crackdowns on immigration. Like there's a lot of bad vibes out there that are hurting housing production. But the reason why I don't necessarily want to fall into that is because I think there are parts of California that are actually seeing permitting surge. So I think there's 2 reasons for hope on the project of what we're up to. The first is in parts of the state that have like basically been, the local governments have also been taken over by YIMBY coalitions. We are seeing a building boom. If you go to Berkeley, or if you go to San Luis Obispo, or if there's some jurisdictions in Silicon Valley, Burlingame, for example, where there's a coalition around growth, and these are places that maybe hadn't built anything for 70 years are now undertaking a big building boom, right? Emeryville is another good example, right? I suspect we'll start to see this place like Santa Monica and Culver City down in Southern California. In places where the state law has changed and local governments have also sort of aligned around it, we're seeing a lot of housing production. And so I think that's like a useful proof of concept. The more we can get more jurisdictions to behave like those, as if they are controlled by YIMBY coalitions, I think the more we're going to see this building boom. Not by accident, I think like 2 of the largest cities in the state that have consistently kind of taken a YIMBY posture, Sacramento and San Diego, are among the 2 cities in the state that have actually seen some progress on permitting and affordability. So I think there's a sort of geographic sort of story you could tell. I think there's also like in the areas where YIMBY reforms have been most thoroughgoing, I think we also see that this is working. So most people by now know California is in the midst of a giant accessory dwelling unit building boom. Something like 1 in 3 to 1 in 4 housing units permitted in California in a typical year are accessory dwelling units. Essentially second homes that might be in an attic or a basement or a backyard or in a converted garage. It was illegal to build these virtually everywhere in California until 2017. And since then, we've seen well over 100,000 ADUs permitted and construction start. And so that's pretty remarkable, right? I mean, that's a reform that costs nothing. I say it's one of the most thoroughgoing examples of the YIMBY idea, because it legalized the type of housing, so dealt with the zoning. It provided ministerial streamlined 60-day approvals. Many jurisdictions approved these projects even faster. It dealt with all the usual cost drivers. So they're exempt from unfunded affordability mandates. There's not a labor requirement tacked on. They're exempt from a bunch of really high impact fees. And so again, when we got exactly what YIMBYs are trying to achieve on many areas of a housing policy, we saw a big building boom, right? Mm-hmm. And so I would say, and I try to tell a similar story in that recent post. I think you're referencing, Gary, about the state density bonus law, right? So I think when it takes time to iterate over laws, but I think that we're seeing meaningful results, and I hope that the legislature will keep refining some of these laws, and we'll continue to see the building boom in more places and of more types.
Last year, I believe it was last year, right before Buffy Wicks came out with a major housing permitting report on, what California could do, policy that she's looking at. Something that stuck with me is that she mentioned that getting bills passed is really just like the start of the battle, because as you know, like, you actually have to follow through to ensure that housing starts happen, that production numbers go up, and that localities don't go in and try to find carve outs wherever possible. And because there is some gap in between that, it allows like an empty space for people who see a political movement growing, try and find and attack that anywhere that they can. I mean, we even see this with Spencer Pratt, who has fully gone out and is a top 3 candidate for LA mayoral race. So this is just someone tweeting into the abyss, but someone who has gaining political power, going out there and saying things like SB 79 was going to upzone and ruin the Palisades when it just wasn't the case. So that empty space is where we have to remain diligent in our job, but also continue to iterate our message. And, you come from like the legislative side, but I guess this is more from like a messaging side, is like, how can you explain the gap from, we pass like huge reforms, and then like the average voter who is not in those rooms with you are still like, okay, great, but like my rent's still going up. So like, as you mentioned, it's a long process, but we still have to go out there every day and fight back a lot of like the misinformation around that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'm going to butcher the saying, right? But it's something like writing is editing, right?
Yeah.
The real, in my experience, often the bill that gets passed first is almost best thought of as like a first draft, and you just know that you're going to have to come back next year and iron it out, and that's, maybe that's just my I'll take credit, maybe that's my own incompetence on not catching a detail or coming up with a creative idea, but it's also just the nature of iterating, and you pass a bill, and then only when the bill is passed, then the entire world looks at it, and then my inbox fills up with 1,000 different recommendations for how we might fix it. We developers, like, for example, one of the things that we've worked on in recent years has been the Starter Home Revitalization Act, SB 684, and the goal of this was to provide streamlined ministerial approvals for small lot townhouse style development all across California. Past that, have to come back next year, SB 1123, do cleanup. I think we passed that in like 2024, so 2 years from now, or 2 years ago. And then this year we're doing cleanup again, and it's SB 1116. I tend to think that it's going to be in a very good place after 1116. And yeah, the stand up has been slow. We're creating a new regulatory framework. Like, real estate and development is inherently a somewhat conservative industry. Everybody's waiting, standing by the pool, waiting to see who's going to jump in first, because they want to see a comp. They want to see something that they can finance against. But these things, they move slowly, and then they start really, really, really picking up. And so, I would just say, it's a process. I think another thing that I've tried to mention lately often is, the closest, it's funny because the closest comp to the modern YIMBY movement, it was the opposite, was the degrowth movement of the 60s and 70s, right? Like, this was an authentic groundswell of people who were frustrated about growth and went out there and passed a bunch of laws that have today basically made it extremely hard to build in places like California and Vermont. But it's funny, if you go back and read their own writing about what they had done, they'll say, oh, like CEQA, we passed CEQA, but it just requires developers to put together a book report and none of it really matters, and the horrible projects that we all hate are still moving forward. Or they would say, oh, okay, yeah, Vermont like adopted this growth control mechanism, but the developers can still go in and get whatever permits they want. And that was true for the first few years, but like what these sort of early sort of pessimists maybe didn't fully appreciate was like once the law is on the books, and once you once you institutionalize like an advocacy and a policy community around that bill, and once you start litigating it, right, the stuff takes on a life of its own, right? And then, so this is a bad version of the story. It's like CEQA goes from being like a 10-page book report that's just like, hey, just so you know, we're polluting, to being like 1,000-word, like, hey, this might be a protected habitat. We don't know. Please don't sue us. Like, so what I'm hoping for a lot of these YIMBY reforms is that we're working in reverse, right? So, you know, we've already seen this, right? The Housing Accountability Act, SB 330, gets adopted a few years ago, and then successive court decisions have made that much stronger. And it's become much clearer to local jurisdictions, like you're not going to get out of this. You can't jerk applicants around. You need to permit housing under certain circumstances. Same with ADU law, right? ADU law gets passed, and then the state regulators say, "Hey, we're tightening up the guidance around this. Like, no, you really do have to allow ADUs. We're not going to let you out of this." So these processes can work in reverse. And I would just flag for people: this is a generational project.
Yeah. So I think that's just a great way of putting it, because like as you say, in Vermont, Act 250 in the early 70s starts as, hey, please make sure you think about how to do sewage and wastewater properly around new developments next to ski resorts in the south of the state. And by the 90s, it is a whole statewide, like, thou shalt not build set of mandates. So I think that's exactly right. They do sort of snowball over time. But as you say, it's a sort of an iterative project. It's not like we're ever just going to get this like snap moment where it's like, oh, problems are fixed. I think sometimes in politics, people want that like cathartic moment of just like, oh, now we fixed it. And it's just like, nah, man, it's a lot more of a slog than that on anything.
People are just right now hitting a level of pessimism where it is making you not trust any even like positive thing that is coming through an institution. Like, it is sadly becoming true of the famous Reagan quote, like, the scariest thing you can hear is the government, I'm the government, I'm here to help. And like, people just do not trust any bills out there, or if they see something passed, like for example, New York City, yes, was just a massive thing to get passed in modern day New York City housing politics. And like the first thing you saw where people are saying like, didn't go far enough, like this is a nothing burger. It's bleeding into so much of our policy making. And it has to do, as you mentioned, like the compounded impacts that are happening across like the federal administration and just like prior inflation worries, where people just think like, well, it's not going to help what I'm seeing right now, thus it's not worthwhile to me. It's almost leading to like policymaking via tantrum. It's a little frustrating to see, because you just told us like the bad case what had happened of people who didn't think they went far enough, and then it just became something we were battling to unravel like decades later. So it is interesting to see the opposite effect of that.
Nolan, I wanted to ask you about your book, even though it's a couple of years old now. You know, it came out 3-4 years ago, and in it, it's Arbitrary Lines for anybody who doesn't know. It's great. It's like the book to read on housing. It's terrific. In it, you basically argued that effectively zoning needs to be abolished, not just like reformed in these like smaller ways. It's a really ambitious argument, and I'm just curious now that it's been out for 3 or 4 years. What about it has stayed the same in your thinking, or what has changed? Are there areas where you'd be even more ambitious? Are there areas where you might pull back from what you said then? Are there areas where you think, you know, I really got that right?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, in my day-to-day work now, I do not roll into meetings with legislators or city council members and suggest to them that they should abolish zoning. You know, I stand by the core argument of the book, which is that I think that American land use planning has just lost its way. It's focused on the wrong things, and there are certain structural aspects of it that will always lead it to bad outcomes, right? One of the things that I was stressing at that point that I think it was controversial maybe when the book came out, but has become much more mainstream, is exclusion is not like an accidental side effect of American zoning. Exclusion is the entire point, right? You cannot understand modern American zoning as focused on externalities or incompatible land uses. It's top to bottom focused on a particular idea of what an acceptable neighborhood looks like and who can live there. And so I think that's become a lot more mainstream. In fact, maybe it was too successful, and there were many other people who came before me who made this argument, and many other people who made this sense. As with any, I think, interesting thought, like 7 different people were having it all at once. But now we're almost to the opposite point where I think people are like, oh, if we could only abolish zoning, like, my life would be great, and I'd have like a 4-bedroom, condo in Midtown Manhattan, and I'd be a millionaire, and, like all my problems, and, my wife wouldn't have left me and all these other things. It's like, yeah, like zoning is I think that's maybe something I would have stressed a little bit more, is like zoning reform is necessary, but not sufficient. Right. And that's if I could say, look, if I could wave a wand and say, get rid of zoning and adopt a system of land use regulations that actually focus on impacts and, coordinating growth with infrastructure capacity. Yeah, I would do that today. But the marginal progress, I think, is pretty valuable. I mean, like, you look at things like state density bonus law, for example, in California. I don't know that I would like pitch it to legislators in this way, but it gets pretty darn close to, for all intents and purposes, getting rid of zoning, right? It's basically like, if you meet this, if you include some affordable units, you can get exemptions from the heights and the setbacks and the lot sizes and yada yada. Like, you get to set your own zoning, right? Or builder's remedy, right? Like in California, if you're just not complying with state housing law, a developer can basically just come in and propose to build whatever they like. Now, these, in the case of state density bonus law, like, it turns out that, yeah, people aren't asking for insane things. In the case of builder's remedy, there aren't a ton of these projects that are moving forward. But in any case, I actually think, like, where California housing policy has ended up is not totally inconsistent with my thoughts around the book of, like, hey, like, let's push the boundary to get people really thinking about, like, this institution, like, just the very nature of the institution. And then I think that creates a safe harbor for a lot of, like, smart reforms that can happen that feel very much within the Overton window. So I think in California, it's kind of a similar thing. It's like, okay, if you just don't follow state housing law at all, we're basically suspending all of your zoning. But if you don't want that to happen, here are a bunch of, like, incremental reforms that are going to allow for a lot more housing that will mostly solve the problem. So, I haven't got a contract yet for 2 arbitrary 2 lines, but maybe I'll return to it and spend a lot more time talking about building codes and housing finance and local government public finance.
Yeah, to pull on that thread a little bit, I guess, like, what is, like, the number one, or maybe like a couple of things that you would say has, like, changed from your point of view, from, like, even like the start of California YIMBY, or the start of, like, drafting arbitrary lines, that you view now, given the amount of success that you guys have had? But, like, as you said, like, it is such an iterative process. So you probably had to learn some things you didn't think you would have to learn at the start of these bills that you think would be useful to our readers or watchers / listeners.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't want to overstate our impact or the impact of any one book. I think this is a real grassroots movement, right? And, like, it's something that I was a part of, and that we're all a part of, and I think it represents a lot of people working on these problems. And so, I would say, I mean, a few things that have impressed me when I was writing Arbitrary Lines, like, I had to really look for a few examples of cities adopting some of the reforms that I discussed, right? Like, I think at the time, probably when I was writing it, I think Berkeley had been one of the only major cities that had eliminated single family zoning. And now legalizing, like, missing middle, low-rise multifamily housing in all residential districts is like, oh yeah, it's just the thing that almost every major American city has either done or they're considering doing, right? Eliminating parking requirements, right? Like, there's pure, like, the closest, like, the land use equivalent of, like, applying leeches to a dying patient, right? Like, parking requirements just make absolutely no sense. But that was still pretty controversial, right? Even as recent as, like, 5 or 6 years ago, it was always like, well, we'll get rid of parking requirements in our downtown, or we'll get rid of parking requirements around transit, or, now it's like, yeah, the number, if you go over to Parking Reform Network's website, you can see this, like, the number of cities that have just wholesale removed minimum parking requirements is, in dozens, maybe hundreds, right? So that's pretty remarkable. I mean, I always say to people, like, part of what the YIMBY movement has done is it's taken a bunch of things that seemed impossible 5 years ago, and it's made them seem inevitable. Something that I'm always sharing is, like, when I did my master's in planning at Rutgers at the Blaustein School. It was an excellent program. But I had a law professor who'd been at this a while, and he made a joke. He said, 2 things will survive the apocalypse: cockroaches and single family zoning. Right. And he made that joke in, like, 2016. Right. And it was just the idea of, like, yeah, no matter what we're going to do, you will never touch single family zoning. And again, well, now it's like ADUs get pretty darn close. And then In many places, we've just started like a duplex to fourplexes. A number of states have done this, right? It's unimaginable. And so I think that like a whole bunch of like in the moment, all the reforms that we're pushing for seem really, really difficult and impossible. But like, things that are impossible yesterday can seem inevitable tomorrow if you just really have that movement, have the right ideas, bring the research, keep making the case, and keep pushing, and don't ever get satisfied with, okay, we passed it, now let's all go home, let's return to our farms. This is a process, and we need to keep, especially in the implementation phase, right? Of like making sure that planners and local cities are actually doing their part. I'd say also too, the regional spread of YIMBY has been really surprising to me, so, of course, the modern YIMBY movement starts here in California, and then you get early YIMBY groups in the Pacific Northwest, and then, Boulder and New York and Massachusetts and Boston. But it's really like a place it's a movement that's really happening in these like extremely high cost coastal areas. But now, in my opinion, some of the most exciting work on this is happening in the Mountain West, and it's happening in the Midwest, and it's happening in the South. You look at Florida's Live Local Act, you look at like the Montana Miracle, you look at all the cool bills that are moving through the legislature in Michigan, and you're like, wow, like I never would have thought that this stuff would be sort of taking off there. I think it's, unfortunately, the housing crisis has to a certain degree gone national, but also even just beyond like overall housing shortage, people are like, we want a range of housing types. We want to be able to live in a walkable neighborhood if that's what we'd like. And so I've been really impressed by how it's just taken off.
Yeah, so I was going to ask you about this because this is something I'm always on, is like as important as it is in California and Boston and stuff, like the YIMBY movement is often like, I think, incorrectly framed as this like very coastal, very professional class thing, but like it's really got a lot to offer a lot of places. Like you mentioned parking reforms earlier, like you can go to that parking reform network map, and it's like places like Birmingham, Alabama have gotten rid of their like parking mandates. So this is something I actually did want to ask you about, is what is something that like red states or just like the non-coastal parts of America can take from like California YIMBY success, or your sort of thinking on housing?
Yeah, well, I think what's happened over the last few years is that affordability has just skyrocketed to be the top number one issue overwhelmingly, right? And what do we mean by housing affordability? Well, what's the number one line item in a typical family's budget? It's their rent or their mortgage, right? And so, this is as true in Alabama as it is here in California. Of course, the magnitude of the crisis is very different, but the solutions necessary to solve it really aren't that different, right? You have to change your zoning to allow for a range of housing types. You have to streamline your permitting processes, and then you have to make sure that you're not imposing a bunch of mandates that makes it financially infeasible to actually build more housing. I always say one of the things that I think YIMBY has been very successful on is that in these otherwise extremely polarized times, YIMBY has managed to remain cross-ideological, cross-partisan. You have Republican YIMBYs and Democratic YIMBYs. Unfortunately, you have NIMBYs of both as well. Even here in California, we require votes on the other side of the aisle, so to speak, to get bills passed. And so, I would say I always return to the Fiorello LaGuardia quote: "There's no Republican or Democratic way to pick up trash." Right? If you've got a housing affordability problem, the solution is to build more housing, and there are a few things that we know work relatively well. One thing I think has been really interesting about YIMBY is that there's different ways of talking about it, right? So, to go to a context that I know a little bit better, Montana, right? Montana is a Republican supermajority state. They've arguably gone the furthest among U.S. states in terms of YIMBY reform. They talk about this stuff in terms of property rights and deregulation and letting markets work, right?
Yeah.
And protecting their natural and working lands, which is, of course, a big factor there. Whereas you head out, here to California, and it's like we spend a lot of time talking about infill development as a way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and slow climate change, and we talk about the sort of racial inequities embedded in exclusionary zoning. Me talking about property rights here would not get us very far, and in the same way that me, talking about segregation would not get us very far in Montana. So I think that like having sort of rhetorical flexibility, I think, is valuable, and it's not dishonest. It's recognizing, hey, what are the values? What are the values that people bring into this conversation? And so how do I position the sort of non-ideological, just objective solution to this in a way that's going to be broadly salient? And so I think that's something that the movement's done effectively. And I'm always nervous, like given that with polarization and other things moving in the wrong direction, like does YIMBY fall victim to this as well? So far, we've managed to avoid that, but it's a tricky balance.
I will say, because as you mentioned before, it is such a grassroots movement. As someone who was able to attend California Lobby Day last week up in Sacramento, it was such a fun experience to go meet people all across the state, meet people who lived in my district, and getting to go to these offices, kind of even closer to like a volunteer level, just to hear from everyone's like point of view on why the housing crisis matters to them, how it affects them personally, and then get to have that one-on-one time with the staffers who were so open to hearing from their constituents, who had some lively discussions, even some where I think were more persuaded at the end of the conversation than what we started with. And as you mentioned, it is like understanding what like YIMBY policies could have impact on, and like how it could be, because we're in California, we were talking more of like the more progressive talking points, and how like if we build enough housing, you are taking power away from landlords and you're handing it back to the buyers and the renters. And seeing the different messaging that landed with some of these staffs firsthand was just like a great experience for me. So it shows like all the work that we have been doing, like a lot of it is online, but like these movements are fast growing. There are housing events, of course, all around. There are many local chapters where you should definitely look up in whatever city you are in to see if there's a chapter close to you. Again, we're coming close to time now, but I did want to end with kind of like a funny or a funky question. What is a kind of like a more cynical or wild NIMBY tactic that you have seen in your years that like just like stayed in your brain and you're like, wow, that's surprising? Because I always think of Mayor Karen Bass saying like, yeah, we were blocking some development simply based on the vibe it brought to the environment. For example, like she didn't want a liquor store in like someone's neighborhood. They said they didn't like the vibe. There was now no more liquor store. So like the fact that we weaponized the term vibe into legislation, into like blocking development, always stays with me. Like that's crazy to me.
Yeah. Well, Tahra, I really appreciate you coming to YIMBY Lobby Day. Yeah, it was awesome. We had 200 people from all across the state come up. And I want to reinforce something you said, which is I think there is a reputation of like YIMBY is this extremely online thing. And yeah, a lot of us do spend far too much time on like X and Blue Sky. Fair. I'm trying to spend less and less. But like, that's not really the movement. Like the movement is like a happy hour that's like 30 people hanging out and talking about these things and then going to city council, right? The movement is like the 200 or so people who drove to Sacramento or flew, or, locals who came out and met with their members. Like that's the power. That's like we benefit a lot from the elite persuasion. Like it really benefits us that like the editorial board of like most major newspapers like agree with YIMBY. Cool. That's awesome. But that's not going to change policy. What's going to change policy is like, if we are having a hearing on a housing development in Sacramento, at least a half dozen people are going to show up from House Sacramento, which is our local YIMBY group. I'm on the board of it. They're an amazing group. They're going to show up and they're going to speak their piece, and they're going to be really nice and charming and cool and tell a really relatable story. And then a bunch of really, maybe a smaller and smaller number of like really, really angry, crazy people who like have their own home that's like 10x in value are going to oppose it. And it's going to be hard for commissioners and city council members over time as that politics entrenches to stay NIMBY. And I think we're going to see more and more of that. I think there's a huge generational shift happening. But again, the bedrock of it is like people going out and like joining these communities and these movements. As far as your actual question here, I think it's pretty well known in YIMBY lore by this point. I think it was Woodside though. They were trying to get out of some state housing law by saying that the entire city was a mountain lion habitat. And to which I said, look, I am happy to oblige them, but if we ever catch a mountain lion, we should release it there if it's a designated habitat. So if they want to like not build duplexes and ADUs, that's cool. But we're gonna we are gonna release mountain lions. My proposal was not taken up, and the Attorney General very quickly threw the book at them and they stopped that. But I think the thing that we struggled with for so long was that the sophisticated NIMBYs always knew that like NIMBYism was not very sympathetic, but so they would find 1,000 other things like, okay, well, like I support housing, but like here's some like superficially plausible environmental concern, or oh, I support housing, but like this doesn't have enough of an affordability requirement, and knowing that if you were to increase that, the project wouldn't pencil anymore. Or oh, this I support no housing, but this needs to be like half the size. And it's like I think like we played like whack-a-mole, I think, with trying to like turn down all of these different YIMBY shell games. And actually what we should have been doing was what we encourage folks to do at YIMBY Lobby Day, which is just tell your story. Like, I support our community. Yeah. Hey, I spent some time living out of my car, or hey, I'm spending half my income on rent, or hey, I grew up here and I don't have a path to homeownership and all my friends are moving away, or hey, I'm going to retire and downsize, but there's no options. That's the one thing that like nobody can really argue with. And it's so, housing is so personal and it's so core to our like financial and mental well-being that like it's hard to just dismiss those arguments. And I think that's something that YIMBY's done effectively is like, let's start with yes. And like, how do we get there? Right. I also think that's a really key part of it too, is like, again, like everybody on X and Blue Sky is like in a bad mood and they're argumentative, but like, going out and being positive in a world where like everyone is upset about everything and everyone is cynical about everything and everything is wrong, and like we prove how smart we are by explaining how bad everything is, in a world where like that's the default, being the person who's like, hey, yeah, I don't know, like I think this housing project might have problems, I don't know, but we need more housing, so please support this project. That's cool and that's revolutionary.
Oh my God, being positive goes such a long way. It is like the number one thing you hear about Mamdani all the time is like, hey, why is this one leftist doing so well with the greater public? I'm like, have you considered that he's really nice? We started from that in terms of the world of persuasion, like going out there, like just like speaking to people as humans. It's sometimes underrated, but it is so worthwhile. Like we already discussed, like just again, getting to hear people's like very personal housing stories in person in a large grassroots capacity like that, to me is just super inspiring and like makes me very happy to do the work that I do.
I would encourage folks to go out and find their local YIMBY group. Start, I pretty regularly get a message in my DMs of like, hey, I'm a YIMBY and I'm in this city or I'm in this neighborhood and I'd love to do YIMBY, but there's no YIMBY group. And I always tell people, well, you're the most excited case, right? You're the most important YIMBY because you're going to be the one that like starts it, right? And so like you just put a tweet out or put a post out saying, hey, I'm trying to just gather YIMBYs, meet here for like a happy hour or meet here for like a Sunday like meet and greet breakfast or something. And let's just start talking, like start building a community, right? It's like classic organizing that like on so many other policy areas, we've all just kind of forgotten how to do because we're all so terminally online. And it's like, just get like a bunch of other like true believers in the room together and talking and showing up. It's funny because it's here in Sacramento. One of the things that we've been wrestling with is the city made nearly all housing development ministerial, meaning that it's not going to be subject to public hearings and political sort of persuasion, which is great. That's good. Like nothing in the economy works well along in a system of like everything gets discretionary approval. But it's also like, oh, what does the YIMBY group do in this context? Like, how do we keep people engaged in a city where we don't constantly have public hearings, where we can get people out there to speak in favor? And so, like, I hope that every other YIMBY group in the country will someday, get to that point where they have that sort of problem. But get out there, start doing the work. It's not super theoretical, difficult work where you need an organizer to come in and teach you how to do it. And that's why I think the movement's been so incredibly successful.
Well, that's amazing. Thank you so much for joining with us. I have definitely loved this conversation. Nolan, where could everyone find you? We'll definitely be sure to link it in our transcript.
Totally. I am regrettably still on most microblogging platforms, so you can find me on X and Blue Sky. I try to periodically post on Substack. But if you're interested in my work at California YIMBY, go to our website, cayimby.org. Subscribe we send out a great newsletter that summarizes housing policy research and gives updates on what we're doing and explains how you can get involved. And so, that's the best way to get involved if you're in California. Across the country, there's two large groups that organize YIMBY chapters. There's Welcoming Neighbors Network and YIMBY Action. Again, go check out their websites if you want to find out how you can get involved.
That's great. Again, thanks for being here and I really appreciate it.
Thank you.